A judge sentences innocent black boy for stealing food, but then the truth shocks everyone. When 10-year-old Jalen is convicted of theft, the shocking revelation of his true parentage shakes the foundations of the justice system. As a troubled judge uncovers the truth, he must confront his past mistakes and battle a corrupt system that threatens to destroy Jalen's life forever. Will justice prevail, or is it too late for redemption? Secrets, betrayal, and a race against time propel the heart-pounding twists toward an unimaginable conclusion. The rain hit the streets hard, turning them into slick, shining puddles. It was a cold night, the kind where even the air felt heavy and soaked through. The area was quiet, save for the occasional distant sound of a car passing, their light flickering in the misty gloom. Jalen, a 10-year-old boy with bright eyes that shone through the darkness, moved quickly through the alleyways. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the cold. His sister, Nia, waited just outside the convenience store, huddled in a too-thin jacket. She rubbed her arms, her teeth chattering from the cold, but she didn't complain. Inside the small convenience store, the shelves were lined with snacks and drinks, all within easy reach. Jalen's stomach growled loudly, but he pushed the hunger away. He needed to get something for Nia. She was too young to understand the weight of their situation, but Jalen knew that in a world where food was scarce, every small grabbing a few bags of chips and some candy, slipping them into his jacket pockets. He kept his eyes on the door, making sure no one would catch him. His hands trembled slightly, but he was too focused on the task to think about the danger. This was all for Nia. As he turned to leave, he was met with a sharp voice. Mr. Powell, the store owner, stood behind the counter, his face hard and disappointed. He was a tall, broad man, his face weathered from years of running the shop. Jalen froze, his heart racing. Mr. Powell's eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, Jalen thought he might get away with it. But the store owner stepped forward, his hand resting on the phone next to him. Jalen's mind raced, but his body reacted before his shoes skidding on the wet floor as he pushed it open and sprinted into the night. "Nia!" he shouted as he ran, his voice loud in the stillness of the street. "Run! Run!" Nia's eyes went wide as she saw her brother running towards her, his face pale. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew her small feet carrying her down the alley, hoping to lose whoever was chasing them. But before they could make it far, the flashing lights of a police car lit up the street. Two officers, both white, stepped out. Officer Duncan, tall and broad, and Officer Reeves, shorter but more aggressive, moved toward them. "Stop right there," Officer Duncan commanded, his voice loud and demanding, his heart in his throat. He was caught. There was nowhere to run. Nia, standing beside him, trembled, holding onto his sleeve. "You're under arrest," Officer Reeves barked, grabbing Jalen's arm roughly. "But Jalen protested, trying to pull away, but the officer's grip tightened. "You're a thief, and thieves belong in jail," Officer Duncan spat, his words dripping with disdain. They shoved him into the back of the police car, Nia's cries echoing in the cold air. "He was just trying to feed me," Nia shouted, her voice cracking with fear. But the officers ignored her, their faces hard as they slammed the door shut. Jalen was left staring out the window, his heart heavy with a sense of hopelessness. The ride to the station felt like hours. The lights of the city flashed past, but his body shivering not from the cold, but from fear. He didn't understand what was happening, only that everything had changed in an instant. Later, the courtroom was quiet, cold, and unforgiving. Jalen sat alone in the oversized jumpsuit, his legs dangling off the chair. The room felt too big for him, and yet he couldn't escape the suffocating sense of who was now seated at the bench, his expression unreadable. Judge Henry Whitaker, a man known for his hard rulings, glanced over at Jalen. He was tall and stern, his gray hair a sign of the years spent handing down decisions. The prosecutor, Craig Holloway, stood beside him, his face set in a grim expression. "This is just the beginning for him," the prosecutor said coldly, pointing at Jalen. Jalen's chest tightened. "I didn't do anything," he whispered, but no one heard him. His public defender, Lisa McCall, barely looked up from her papers as she spoke. He's had a difficult life, she said, her voice barely louder than a murmur. His mother is dead, his father unknown, and his grandmother is struggling to care for him. The words felt empty to Jalen. It was all just a list of facts. I was just hungry, Jalen said, his voice small and full of fear. But Judge Whitaker didn't seem to care. He didn't even acknowledge Jalen's plea. I sentence you to 3 years in juvenile detention, the judge declared, his voice cold and final. The words hit Jalen like a punch to the gut. His grandmother, Ruth, sitting in the front row,
into the arms
let out
of
a friend
soft
beside her, her face twisted with grief. Jalen looked at her, his heart heavy with guilt. He had failed her. But more than that, he had failed himself. The life he knew was gone, and all he could do now was wait for whatever came next. Jalen's face lingered in Judge Whitaker's mind long after the court session almost ended, pleading, yet so full of vulnerability that it unsettled him. The fear in Jalen's eyes, the helplessness in his posture, Whitaker couldn't shake the image of him sitting in that cold courtroom, too small for the oversized jumpsuit. As he sat alone in his office that night, the dim light of his desk lamp flickering, Whitaker's thoughts drifted back to the case, as he often was. But something about this one nagged at him. The way Jalen had spoken, as if he didn't fully understand what had just happened to him, made the judge feel like he had missed something. He reached for the file that contained Jalen's case and opened it again, scanning through the details of the arrest, the prosecutor's remarks, the public defender's background notes, which briefly mentioned Jalen's mother, Monica Lewis. The name struck a chord deep in Whitaker's memory. Monica. She had been a part of his past, a part he had tried to forget. He closed his eyes, remembering her face, her eyes, the way she had looked at him all those years ago. A sudden realization hit him. Monica had once told him she was pregnant. He had dismissed her. He hadn't even when she begged him to listen. Now, seeing Jalen's face in the courtroom, it all started to come back to him. Whitaker's hand trembled as he pulled out Jalen's birth certificate. His eyes narrowed as he read the final line. Father, unknown. He didn't need to read the rest. His stomach twisted as the pieces began to fall into place. Jalen's father was a judge. A white judge, his thoughts and swirled. That judge was his Whitaker pulse himself, quickening as he tried to make sense of what this meant. How had he not put this together before? How had he sentenced his own flesh and blood without even realizing it? His hands were shaking now, and he slammed the birth certificate down onto the desk. The guilt crept in, wrapping around him like a suffocating fog. He had ruined a boy's life, a boy who was his son, mind raced just because of who he was, retracing every decision he had made as a judge. The biased rulings, the harsh sentences for black boys, the way he had always viewed them as trouble before they even spoke. His entire career, his entire life, had been built on these decisions that now seemed tainted by his own ignorance. The door to his office creaked open, and Whitaker's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp knock of his assistant. Judge Whitaker, there's someone here to see you, the assistant said. A private investigator. He says it's urgent. Whitaker nodded, though he didn't feel prepared for what was about to come. He stood up from his desk, wiping his clammy hands on his trousers. A middle-aged man with a tired expression stepped into the room. Landry was dressed in a plain suit, his eyes scanning Whitaker as if measuring him up. What's this about? Whitaker asked, his voice more strained than he intended. Landry didn't waste time with pleasantries. I'm looking into the background of a boy named Jalen Lewis. I believe you know him. Whitaker's stomach raised an eyebrow. What's this about? You were the judge who sentenced him today, weren't you? I've been going through his family history, and I have some questions about his father. The words stung, but Whitaker did his best to maintain composure. I've already seen the boy's file. His father is unknown. There's nothing to dig up. Landry crossed his arms. I disagree. I've spoken to his grandmother, you might want to hear. Something important. Whitaker's heart dropped. He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. What did she say? Landry hesitated for a moment before speaking. Ruth said that Monica, Jalen's mother, told her that Jalen's father was a white man. A judge. Whitaker's breath caught in his throat. He had already suspected, but hearing it aloud felt like the affair with Monica all those years ago. He remembered the way she had looked at him, the way she had begged him to listen when she had told him about the pregnancy. But he had ignored her, not wanting to be tied to her or the situation. He had been a judge, too proud, too focused on his career to care about the life he had helped create. Now, everything made sense.
What do you want with me,
Jalen's
Landry?
father was him, Whitaker asked, his voice shaking despite himself. Landry's eyes softened for a moment. I want you to understand the damage you've caused. Jalen may be your son, but you've never seen him as a person. You've sentenced him based on the color of his skin, just like so many others before him. Whitaker felt the weight of Landry's words settle from the truth, convincing himself that his decisions were justified. But now, as the truth stared him in the face, he couldn't deny it any longer. Landry stepped closer, lowering his voice. You've ruined his life, Whitaker, but you have a chance to fix it. Whitaker stood still, the room sudden of his actions, so confident in his judgments. But now he could see the cracks in everything. His guilt consumed him, leaving him paralyzed. I'll do what I can, Whitaker muttered, though he didn't believe his own words. Landry turned to leave, but before he walked out, he paused. It's not just about Jalen, Judge.
And it's
About the system you've helped build. Whitaker was left alone in his office, staring at the papers on his desk. His mind reeled as he realized the full extent of his actions. His entire life, his career, had been shaped by bias and injustice. And now, the truth had caught up with him. The boy in that courtroom was his son. The weight of his guilt hung over Judge Whitaker like a suffocating cloud,
he took
but he heavier than the last, especially as he tried to navigate the complicated web he had woven for himself. His mind constantly returned to Jalen and the decision that had shattered his life. He had been certain that he could fix this, but nothing he tried seemed to make any difference. He sat in his office late one evening, the dim light casting long shadows across the idea of reversing the damage he had done. He picked up the phone, dialing the number of the prosecutor's office, hoping that there was some way to fix this. When the call was answered, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. I need to revoke Jalen Lewis's sentence, he demanded, his voice trembling slightly. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a cold response. The boy's where he belongs. Let it go. Whitaker clenched his jaw, his mind racing as he heard the finality in the prosecutor's voice. They were right. The system was built to protect itself, and no matter how much he wanted to change the outcome for Jalen, the powers at play were too strong to fight. His hands shook as he hung up the phone.
What was he doing now?
His thoughts overcrowded juvenile facility. Was he still in that same cold, unforgiving place, surrounded by kids just like him? Determined to make one last attempt, Whitaker drove to the facility the next morning. The journey was long, and the distance felt like an eternity. When he finally arrived, the grim reality of the place hit him. The building was tall and imposing, its walls covered in graffiti and filled with the smells of sweat and metal. Whitaker was escorted to a small room where Jalen sat, staring out the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The boy didn't even look at him when Whitaker entered the room. Jalen, Whitaker said softly, taking a step forward. I came to. You came to what? Jalen interrupted, his voice flat. Tell me how sorry you are.
Finally looked at Whitaker.
Tell me you're going to. His eyes full of anger and disbelief. You're just another man who doesn't care. Whitaker felt the sting of those words, but he didn't step back. He had come too far to give up now. I do care, Jalen. I know I made a mistake, and I'm here to make it right. Jalen shook his head, his expression cold. It's too late for that. You already stole my future. The boy's Whitaker stood there than any punishment could. He had failed Jalen. And now, it seemed, there was no way to undo the damage. Whitaker drove back to his house that evening, his mind reeling with everything that had just happened. He had tried to reach Jalen, to show him that he was sorry. But Jalen had already made up his mind. He had lost faith in a system that had failed him, and in the man who had once been his father. When he arrived home, his wife, Susan, was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. She didn't look up when he entered, but the tension in the air was palpable. You're still going after this? She asked quietly, her voice laced with disappointment. Whitaker ran a hand through his hair, trying to explain.
I can't just sit here
I have to
knowing what
fix
I
it,
did, Susan.
Susan stood up and walked toward him, her face hard with anger. You've already done enough damage, Henry. Look at what it's done to us. She gestured to the papers spread across the table, newspaper articles, public outcries, the political fallout from his sentence of Jalen. Whitaker's career, his family's reputation, everything was their backs on him, and the public no longer trusted him. I can't let this go, Whitaker said, his voice barely a whisper. I have to make it right. His wife shook her head, her expression a mix of sorrow and frustration. You can't fix everything, Henry. Not this. Not after all that's happened.
Instead, he spent
Whitaker
the next
didn't
few
respond.
days
Locked away in his study, searching for any way to overturn the sentence. He read through the case files, digging into every detail, looking for a mistake, an error that would give him the chance to correct the injustice. His mind was clouded with guilt, but he couldn't stop. He knew the system was rigged. He had been a part of it for years. But now, he had to make things right for Jalen. In a desperate move, Whitaker fabricated new evidence, claiming that there had been a clerical error in Jalen's sentencing. He filed a motion to reopen the case and set a new hearing. His career and legacy were at stake, but it didn't matter anymore. The day of the hearing arrived, and Whitaker stood before the court, shaking, knowing he was risking everything. His colleagues, the prosecutor, even the defense attorney, but they were all focused on him now. Your Honor, Whitaker began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I've come to inform the court that there was an error in the sentencing of Jalen Lewis. I request that the sentence be overturned. The room fell silent. For a moment, it felt like the man who had known Whitaker for years looked at him, his eyes narrowed. What kind of error are you referring to, Judge Whitaker? Whitaker took a deep breath, his hands shaking. There were discrepancies in the way the case was handled, Your Honor. I believe Jalen's sentencing was unjust, and I request that he be released. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but the judge nodded slowly. It felt like hours before the decision was finally made. But when the judge spoke again, Whitaker's heart sank. The motion is granted. The sentence is overturned. Jalen was free. Whitaker stood outside the courthouse, his heart in his throat, waiting for the boy to walk out. His actions had led to this moment, and now he would finally get the chance to step out of the courthouse. Whitaker took a step forward. Jalen, he called, his voice breaking the silence. I'm your grandfather. Jalen paused for a moment, but he didn't turn to face Whitaker. Not to me, he said quietly, before turning and walking away. Whitaker stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as Jalen and Ruth disappeared into the boy, but it had cost him more than he could ever repay. He collapsed onto the steps of the courthouse, his career in ruins, his heart heavy with regret. The justice he had fought for had come too late.